and welcome to Cosmetics Business in Conversation with Spectra Packaging. I'm Becky Barge, News Editor at Cosmetics Business, and for today's conversation, I am joined by Jonathan Powell, Sales Director of Spectra. Hi, Jonathan. It's a pleasure having you on Cosmetics Business in Conversation with Spectra.
Hi, Becky. It's lovely to be invited. Thank you very much for having me.
It's our pleasure. So I know that we're here for you to tell us a little bit more about Spectra Packaging, what it is that you specialize in. So I guess let's start at the very beginning. And what is Spectra and what is it that you do?
Okay. Spectra Packaging is a manufacturer of plastic packaging, predominantly for the toiletries and cosmetics industry. We've been in business since 2008, so we're just coming up for 14 years. We're a privately owned company, and we do anything from extrusion blow molding bottles, injection stretch blow molded bottles, injection molded closures, and then we also do things like silkscreen printing and hot foil stamping for decoration. And we even design and manufacture our own tools, whether that be sort of standards, which we've got nearly 300, or whether it is bespoke tooling for our customers.
Amazing. And I think it would be really interesting to know for our viewers here, as a packaging supplier, what are the challenges that you're facing, due to the increasing awareness around plastic and the environment?
That's a really good question. There's a lot of misinformation out there at the moment, and plastics is hugely under the microscope and has been for the last sort of 3 years or so. It's really easy to assume that going out there and just replacing plastics with alternative materials is going to solve all of our environmental issues. And really, that's not the case. We've had a huge amount of demonization of plastics, and really what that ends up doing is minimizing or devaluing the actual environmental values and societal values that plastic really plays, which I think has probably been highlighted a lot more during the COVID-19 pandemic when we've talked about PPE, ventilators, down to sanitizer containers and things like that. So it's really easy, and it really has been a massive focus on end of life. There's been lots of very emotive images in the media seas of plastic floating, or islands of plastic floating out there and things like that. But really, a lot of these challenges, end of life is only one part of it. A lot of these challenges are avoidable if they're handled responsibly. Converters like myself, we've got huge responsibility to take on brand owners, but also we need to really be addressing things like infrastructure for recycling, and also consumer behaviour, which plays a massive part. It's important that we're doing our part, but if somebody drinks a bottle of soda and then throws that just out onto the side of the road, onto the pavement, whatever, that's not being disposed of responsibly. Similarly, if it's going to general waste and we're not segregating things out into recycling and so on, that's not helpful.
Yeah, it's a tough balance in, consuming and then also having the infrastructure to be able to deal with those products and then make sure that they're sent to the correct place.
It is, but it's not a new issue. I remember as a child taking a glass bottle back to the corner shop and getting my 20 pence back from the guy behind the counter, in a very formative deposit return scheme system, which actually, in significant parts of Europe, they already operate. Consumer behaviour is hard to impact, and infrastructure is hard to impact, but where there's a will, we're used to seeing big glass recycling bins, in our supermarket car parks and so on and so forth. We're starting to see an increase in segregated bins in public spaces. Retailers, people like McDonald's have been doing it for quite some considerable time. You go into a McDonald's and you see, you put your non-recyclable waste here and you put the other bits here. So infrastructure's starting to get there. But again, consumer behaviour needs to be impacted. And I think realistically that will happen with things like deposit return schemes, where actually we're reinforcing the value to the consumer and then saying, right, you need to do something about that. If you want your money back, take your bottle back and you'll get something back for that.
Yeah.
And infrastructure, consistency is another battle when we talk about infrastructure. It's great to see the private sector doing it, and it's great to see local councils making a real effort. But all the while that we are leaving decisions around waste management to local councils, we really are missing the opportunity to unify across the country. in some places, recycling simply goes for incineration to generate electricity. That's not really the right way to be handling these things. But by leaving it to local councils, we're not giving that infrastructure a chance to really unify and homogenise across the country.
Yeah, I mean, and on that point, talking about infrastructure and cycles, am I right in saying that Spectra has just carried out its own independent LCA? In B, for people that don't know what that is, could you maybe explain a little bit more about that and your findings?
Yeah, absolutely. So I mentioned earlier, we talk hugely about end of life, and the focus is very much on end of life. But when we're talking about the environmental impact of our packaging and the things that we consume, end of life is really just only one piece of the puzzle. So what we really need to be looking at is the whole life of our products. And this is done by something called a life cycle analysis. And a life cycle analysis looks across 6 key stages of our products, from ingredients and raw material supply, whether that be for the polymers or the glass or whatever it's going to be, but including as well the things that actually go into our products, so things that make up our shampoos and so on and so forth. So it takes up the whole thing. The packaging manufacture, the manufacturing of the products themselves and the filling of those, distribution, storage of those things, then the consumer usage, and then finally the end of life and how these things are disposed of. So it's 6 key stages of the whole life cycle. And then those are measured across 5 levers. So you're looking at greenhouse gas emissions, we're looking at non-renewable energy, we're looking at freshwater consumption, land usage, and then the impact on the ecosphere of these products. So that's what an LCA does. We've had one commissioned. It's by an independent company, a company called Medulla. So they come in and they look at our business, and what we've tasked them to do is to take an identical product made out of HDPE through an extrusion blow mold process, a PET container made from an injection stretch blow molding process, a glass container, and an aluminium container. And what we've done is we've set these as a level playing field. So we've said we've used 30% recycler in the HDPE and PET containers, which is in line with the upcoming government mandate around plastic packaging taxes. And then we've used, based on the current recycling rates of glass and aluminium, I think 60% glass and 70% aluminium. So we've incorporated recycled materials in those, and we've looked at the overall life cycle impact of taking a 300ml container in any of these formats, shipping it to the same direction, to the same place, filling it with the same product, moving it around and seeing the same consumer use. And doing that, we've then had that independently assessed. The only area where there's any differences, we've had obviously with the HDP and PET, we've specifically looked at our supply chain as a business, and some of the differences that we have as a company, and some of the things that we've done as a business as well to try and improve our carbon footprint and our environmental credentials. So we've taken that process, we've taken these 4 identical components, and we've done the same thing with them, and we've had a look at that. And the results are really interesting. So if I was to take a couple of the levers, for example, so if we were to talk about greenhouse gas emissions, which everyone kind of understands, if you make 100,000 HDP containers, the equivalent greenhouse gas emissions would be like traveling a little under 18,000 miles in a regular passenger car. Okay. That's the kind of greenhouse gas emissions you're looking at. If you were to replace that HDP bottle with an aluminium container, it would be the equivalent of doing over 51,500 miles in the same car. So we're talking nearly 3 times higher greenhouse gas emissions versus an HDPE container, which is significant. Similarly, if we talk about fresh water consumption, so to make that same volume of HDPE containers, that same 100,000, you're talking about 1.2, 1.3 days worth of water usage for an average household in the UK. To make the same number of containers in aluminium, you're talking nearly 10 days worth of household water usage. So you're talking over 7.5 times the amount of water usage to make those same number of containers. That to me is really interesting. So what we've done, we've had this done. It's available on our website. Anyone can come and look at it. As I say, it is independent. The full breakdown of the specification of the products, are available there for anyone to see, as are all the findings broken down by all the stages and all the levers, as well as a summary. But if we were to sort of set a baseline, HDPE came out by far the best environmentally, with PET following it, followed by glass, followed by aluminium. But if we were to talk about the overall environmental impact and set HDPE as the baseline, PET has a 44% higher environmental impact than HDPE over the whole life cycle of the product, compared to glass, which has a 274% higher environmental impact to HDPE, and aluminium, which goes as high as 316%. So you start to see why when we talk about life cycle analysis, it's really, really important that we don't just focus, as we are at the moment, on this end of life problem. It's an important problem and we must address it. Recycling rates for plastics are around 40%, but on bottles, actually around 59%. Whereas when we go into glass and aluminium, we're at 65 to 75% sort of range. So it's important that we work on that to try and improve that. But it's really important we look at that wider picture as well. And that's why we've gone to this stage.
Yeah, I think it's, there is a common misconception that by getting rid of plastic straight away, opting for something such as glass, that it's an easy fix. It's not quite as simple as that. There are so many other factors that play into that. And there is a place for plastic within this world. It's an incredibly useful tool. It's just, being able to dispose of it correctly. And your findings show that it is useful, and shouldn't have this black mark on it as much as people do think.
And you're right, it's the right product for the right thing. If I go to the supermarket and I buy a broccoli that's wrapped in shrink film, is that the right use for plastics? Yeah. I'm not certain about that. You'd have to start looking at what that does to protect food and how that impacts food waste and so on and so forth. But there is a question mark that needs to be answered there. But when we start looking at things like we've just gone through, and we're talking about a 300 ml container being used to package up personal care items, it's very evident that this is the right way to be doing it. But actually what we need to be doing is addressing that end of life area and saying, well, let's address that, let's improve our recycling infrastructure, let's place a higher level of value on it, so that we can deal with that. And we'll take something that's all very good and make it even better.
Yeah.
And that's really where we feel that focus needs to be.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. And Jonathan, you mentioned a little bit earlier about the new tax that's been brought in by the government. What's Spectra's sort of stance on that? What's your position on the government's forthcoming plastic tax?
Well, I think overall we're supportive of the idea. We think that it's something that should be done. Spectra has been championing recycled materials since we started. So way back in 2008, from day one, we've been out there trying to get people on board. And it's lovely to see government legislation behind it and also a change in consumer behaviour. I remember having meetings right back in 2008 with early clients and showing them recycled material boxes, and I think, it doesn't look very nice. I don't know that our consumer will buy that. And those brands that were adopting it were almost a bit maverick by doing so. And it's really lovely to see the consumer behaviour is changing, consumers are more accepting, and to see the government trying to push that forward. So overall, we're supportive of it. There are going to be some challenges that come alongside that. And we touched on it earlier about infrastructure. When we start talking about moving everybody to 30% recycling, we're going to seriously put strains on the infrastructure. We're going to see feedstocks becoming harder to get hold of. We're going to be seeing simply that increased demand is going to spread that thinner and thinner and thinner, which is going to cause a challenge. But in order to see improvement, it's always demand before supply, isn't it? So in order to see improvement in infrastructure and to see that investment take place, then there needs to be that increased demand. And if this legislation helps that, then I think it can only be a good thing. The interesting thing will be to see what happens with that tax. And is that tax ring-fenced and put aside for improving those infrastructures and ensuring that we manage our waste better? Or does that money go into the general treasury pot and is used in other areas? But I think, it is important. But as I said, the other thing is it doesn't address, I mentioned this earlier, it's that consumer behaviour. We hope that the demand will drive improvement in infrastructure as businesses investors, but we also need to see that that improved consumer behaviour. And until people really start to place value on plastics, that's going. We're only addressing one part of it, and this is where I think maybe things like deposit return schemes that we see in Scandinavia very successfully adopted is something that we ought to be considering over here.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, and let's hope that that tax does eventually go into building better infrastructure. And Jonathan, as well, you mentioned sort of PCR, plastic, and demand for growing amongst consumers. What are the different options out there for beauty brands in terms of PCR percentage? How do those different options look, and are they suitable for beauty brands?
Yes, so that's again, it's a good question. As a business, we operate on 3 standard levels. We operate 30%, 50%, and 100%. So if somebody wants 100% recycled material in their bottle, they can have it. Although I do have to stress that we don't know what's going to happen with supply, and if demand does exceed supply, then those 100% might be facing a little bit more of a challenge. But at present, we are very comfortable doing up to 100%. In terms of beauty brands, it's a very viable option, and we do regularly supply in those levels. There does need to be an understanding from those brands, and then obviously eventually the consumer that there are colour variations that come alongside those based on feedstocks. If we think that HDPE predominantly comes from milk bottles, the vast majority of milk that's sold in this country is semi-skimmed, but there's an awful lot of full fat and an awful lot of skimmed. And when we're selling that, there are contaminants that come alongside that, little bits of cap and little bits of label and those kinds of things that come in there and affect that colour. Historically, the colour tolerance has been quite wide on recycled materials, and that has never really changed. In the last 10 years, we have seen manufacturers use less of the tolerance, if that makes sense. If we set a very wide tolerance out here, we've been seeing them coming closer and closer and closer, but the tolerance hasn't changed. As we're seeing demand increase and the need to widen their search for feedstocks, we're seeing that tolerance move out a little bit. So I think for beauty brands, it's fine to do whatever they really want, whatever they feel they can communicate effectively to their consumer and get buy-in from the consumer. They just need to be understanding that we are going to see those variations. They probably are going to widen a little bit in the short to mid-term as infrastructure catches up with demand. And then I think we will then eventually see them tighten back down again. The good news is, I mentioned earlier, the consumer historically wasn't particularly bought in. But with this heightened media presence and this heightened awareness of plastics and recycling, I think the consumer now is a lot more open to these kinds of things, and they're a lot more savvy. They see that kind of colour variation and they know what it means, and it's almost like a badge of honour. It's integrity. It's showing that we are using it. So I don't think brands need to be as concerned as historically we would have been maybe 10 years ago.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think even more now so, consumers are much more receptive to it in a way. If they see that something's a little bit different or it's not necessarily quite right, in a way, it's a form of, eco badge on there in a way for brands.
Yeah.
That's what they want to be showing, that we're taking those steps to do something different.
That's exactly right. And that's the change of consumer habit, consumer attitude that we have seen over the last 10 years.
Yeah. So what is it, Jonathan, that Spectra are doing to sort of help beauty brands, do the right thing?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, since our inception in 2008, Spectra has really been championing recycled materials. But it isn't just recycled materials. We think it's really important as a responsible manufacturer that we're doing everything we can to minimise our environmental impact. So when we built the factory we're in now in 2011, we used a huge amount of recycled materials going into the factory itself. We planted over 650 trees around our sites. We use a lot of much more energy efficient technology. So we're using things like air source heat pumps to run all of our heat throughout our factory. All of our lighting has just been moved from energy efficient bulbs to LED bulbs throughout the entire factory. And as we expand, we're constantly assessing what technologies we're using and how we can reduce our impact. Obviously, as a growing business, we're always effectively consuming a little bit more, but it's about trying to reduce our environmental impact, our carbon footprint on a per container basis. And we do a huge amount of that because we think it's important for us to take that level of responsibility. So moving on from there, back in 2018, we introduced our PCR 10 initiative, which saw us introduce 10% recycler as standard to any of our blow molded containers, whether that's HDPE or PET. So if you were working with Spectra, that's what you were getting. And you needed to opt out if that's something that you didn't want or ask to increase. Now, last year, we replaced that with our PCR 30 initiative. So now as a default position, if you work with Spectra, you then get 30% recycler as standard. And again, you have that opportunity to opt out or to increase to 50% or 100%, but that's your choice. But the onus, we've taken that onus upon ourselves to say, well, actually, this is the right way to behave. This is how we want to operate as a business. We feel that this is ethical, this is important. So we're not going to ask our customers, whether they're manufacturers or brand owners or whatever, to make that decision. We're going to make that decision for them. And then if they don't want to do it that way, or they've got a better way or a different way of approaching it, then we're very open to that as well. So that's really been how we're approaching it. And that, from day one, really, wherever we can, it's been about, okay, how can we take some of that on board ourselves, rather than the sort of more conventional, well, you can have this or you can have this, but it's up to you. That's down to you. We very much know, actually, we need to take some responsibility.
Yeah, and that'll be hugely, a benefit for brands, something less that they necessarily have to think about. There's a lot going on there. If that can be sort of taken out of their worries and, put on by you, I think that's a great way to help each other. It's just great.
It's important. I think businesses need to take responsibility for their own practices. We are a manufacturer. We are going to be consuming energy. We are going to be making plastic components. But it's really important that we take some responsibility rather than just leaving it to other people and saying, well, it's not really our problem. It absolutely is our problem. Similarly, this year we moved all of our energy to green energy supply, so we're getting entirely all of our electricity is now being sourced renewably and sustainably. So it's things like that we just think are important. But also greatly going full circle, these things are also then reflected in our LCO, which then helps when we're talking about how it's not just about plastics, but it's about Spectra made plastics.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, on that topic of working with Spectra, what's the best way for a prospective, company to get in touch with you? How can they work with you?
Well, I'm very old-fashioned, so I still love a telephone. I like to talk to people. Yeah. So you can get hold of us. Our number is 01986 834 190, and that will get you through to our customer services team. But we do have a fantastic website as well, which is www.spectrapackaging.co.uk, which will take you through all of the products and services that we operate. There's some really useful tools on there that show you how you can take standard packaging and make it more than the sum of its parts, for if you're a brand owner looking to do something like that, or how we can take you on that more bespoke journey if that's something that's important to you. But then also the things that we've been talking about today. We have a great section called My Spectra where our customers can sign up. They get their own private login area, and they get instant access to a huge range of really useful documents, including the LCA, things to help them understand it, things we do on biopolymers, a lot of information about our social responsibility campaigns. They can also request samples through our website. They can flag pages of interest to then share with colleagues and so on and so forth. So, and that's a really powerful tool if people are able to take advantage of it.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Well, Jonathan, thank you ever so much. It sounds like you have a really exciting 2022 ahead of you. And yeah, thank you again for joining me for this conversation. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you very much, Becky, for the invite. It's been lovely to meet you and have this conversation.
It's been wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
And that was Cosmetics Business in conversation with Spectra Packaging. And if any of our viewers would like to discover more interviews with companies like Spectra from across the beauty industry, head to our YouTube channel and hit subscribe, or visit cosmeticsbusiness.com.